Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Advancement Center. And as always, welcome to the world of magic and miracles. And welcome to the continued reading of The Magic of Life by Robert Young. And I'm continuing with chapter 24. Welcome to my home. It's just down a path there to the front door, and we'll go and have a look around, said Henry joyfully. Bill moved slowly along the path. He could not believe all of the different kinds of plants and beautiful flowers and trees that he had never seen before on the island. He was walking slower and slower, and as he moved along, until Willem said very abruptly, "Bill, get a move on." Bill snapped out of it and kept moving. It was as if Bill was still a 10-year-old child. He responded the same way, and Willem spoke to him in exactly the same manner as when he had been a 10-year-old. It seemed like Willem was there with two young boys that he used to teach, and things had not changed. That picture quickly flicked through Bill's consciousness, and he smiled as he moved on. When they approached the entrance to the house, the large carved doors stood out in front of the three of them, and Bill's mouth gaped open once again. Henry walked straight up, and instead of just flicking open the door, he pulled something from his pocket, and he seemed to be fiddling with the knob. The door opened, and Bill looked quickly at what Henry had in his hand, but could not understand what it was. "What are you doing?" Bill asked Henry. Henry laughed as he replied, "I never thought. You've never seen a door lock, have you?" Bill frowned. "Yes, I've seen a door lock before. I've got a lock on my own door." Henry laughed again. "No, I mean a lock that's inside the handle." Bill's interest changed immediately. Henry was right. He had never seen a lock that was inside a handle, so he walked up closer and had a good look. The door was open at this time, and he kept his focus on the door and the handle and looked inside and out. He thought to himself, "That's quite good. I'll have to get one of those." He then looked up and saw the immense hallway, something he could never have imagined would be part of a household, and he quickly looked around at Henry as if to say, "Wow, where did that come from?" He looked back at the hall and entered slowly. Henry stood there smiling and understood what was happening to Bill. He smiled at the fact that Bill acted just like a little child, as he did not need an invitation. He just walked straight in and with those big eyes glowing, looked around at everything. Henry remembered it was just like how they were when they were children. When he turned back to Willem, Bill had no idea that Willem had already seen these types of buildings. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" Bill asked. Willem almost blushed as he turned and looked at Henry, then looked back at Bill and answered, "Yes, I actually built this place." Then everybody's eyes opened wide. Henry and Bill were unaware of this, and Willem was quite embarrassed because he had no intention of ever telling anyone that he had actually been a designer and construction manager in such a town. Willem was a school teacher, but he had talents that nobody had ever known about, and he had worked with Sally many times to build some beautiful buildings. When he worked for Sally, though his name had not been Willem, it was Heinrich. He could not even spell Heinrich when he first decided to use his second name to cover all the paperwork associated with Norwich. Fancy a man like Willem saying he could not spell Heinrich. He knew how to spell it in his German language, but not how to spell it in the English language, and so he simply spelt it the way it sounded. As soon as Henry heard the name, it registered with him because he had seen it many times on the building certificates and the ownership documents of many of the places he had actually purchased. He wanted to jump straight in and ask Willem, "Why are you living where you are when you own so much property?" But he said nothing. He wondered how could such a man with such a talent live two totally different lives and then walk away from a fortune to live in the country. Henry knew that there were many buildings that he had tried to purchase. He virtually owned everything around them and owned everything to do with those buildings, but the final handover of buildings was not possible without this man called Heinrich. Henry had assumed ownership of many things because he thought Heinrich had disappeared, and therefore he, or the Olsen family, may as well own it as they owned everything else. This new turn of events in Henry's life caused quite a disturbance in his mind, yet it did not seem to bother Willem at all. It actually embarrassed him. It took a while for Willem's color to come back to normal, and neither Bill nor Henry broached the subject again. The view was all too attractive, too engrossing, and too beautiful to even consider what was happening in the outside world. The three men were engrossed in the pleasure of one another's vision, and although Henry had looked out the window every day, he had never felt as grand as he did now, sharing this view with his two dear friends. Friends that he knew he had been associated with for many years, many ages, and associated with in times that he had not yet discovered. Henry had been left much in his father's will, and up until this point, he had never considered the possibility that some of the ownership may still be lost in the mystery surrounding the name Heinrich. However, at this point, as he looked out over the heads of his two dear friends and described all of the different buildings and how everything worked, he felt a sense that maybe his empire did not really belong to him. For the man called the teacher for so many years was actually the man named Heinrich, who held the mystery to much of his father's fortune. So without mentioning his thoughts, he registered that at some stage he would take up the matter with Willem and get it all sorted and cleared up once and for all. At this point in time, though, it was not suitable, and he was feeling a great pull towards Mary. Henry wanted to introduce Mary to people from another part of the island, and he was sure that Mary knew nothing about these people. He was certain that she had no idea that the island was split and that there were people living in an almost foreign world just around the corner from where they lived. Somehow everything was opening up inside Henry, and he was so excited about revealing something new to his dearest and most devoted friend, Mary. He even surprised himself when he said to Bill, "Bill, you'll have to come and meet Mary, my fiancée. You'll really like her. And Willem, I'm sure you already know Mary. Even if it's not from here, you will know her. She is much like you." Henry smiled as he listened to himself and started to laugh when Willem replied, "I'd be extremely honored to meet your fiancée, just as I'm sure Mary will be pretty honored to find out she is your fiancée." Willem's familiarity surprised Henry, but he laughed, and just like Willem, he blushed when he thought of the awkward position that he had just placed himself in. So when he asked Willem and Bill to not say a word about the fiancé bit, because he hadn't really asked Mary at this stage, they both understood. So off they went back down the hallway towards the door, chatting and joking about their visit to Mary. They had just passed the entrance to Henry's office and were not too far from the door when the phone rang. To Bill, it just sounded like some alarm going off, something totally out of this world. It was something he had never heard before, and he immediately stopped in his tracks. Henry excused himself and said, "I'll just answer the phone," before he walked into his office. Bill turned to Willem and asked, "What's he talking about? What's a phone?" "I'll leave that to Henry to explain," replied Willem. Bill stood there once again with his eyes wide open, wondering what he was about to hear. In the quietness, he could hear Henry speaking. To Bill, it sounded like Henry was speaking to nobody and answering as well. Bill looked with a strained look at Willem, but Willem simply smiled and put his hand up as if to say, "Just wait, Bill." So Bill stood there once again, mildly chastised by the teacher of many years ago. Henry finished his conversation and quickly joined his two friends before ushering them out the door. Bill was almost tripping over his feet because he just had to open his mouth, and he could not do anything but ask. His excitement about asking almost prevented him from walking, and he almost tripped and fell while going out the door. Henry grabbed him by the shoulder and asked, "What's wrong, Bill?" They all stopped, and Bill finally asked, "What's a phone, Henry?" Henry looked at Willem and said, "So, you didn't tell him?" Bill's eyes flickered backwards and forwards between Henry and Willem, wondering what they were keeping from him. "Nope, it's up to you, Henry," answered Willem. Henry stopped and explained. "It's like this, Bill. There's a small device called a telephone, and it's linked to other telephones by wires." Bill was puzzled and asked, "Wires? What are wires?" "They're just like the ropes and the cables that you have on your boat." "No, I must have said it wrong. You know the cables that go to the lights on your boat?" asked Henry. Yes, of course," said Bill. "Well, they run those, although they're a bit smaller than what you've got on your boat. They run them for miles, and they hook a telephone on each end, and people can talk to one another," explained Henry. "Like a radio?" asked Bill. Henry and Willem looked at one another, and Bill said, "Yeah, I've got a radio. I've got two when we work on the boat." "Well, you can have the same thing on land. You can put two radios on land and talk to one another," said Henry. Bill thought for a while and said, "Yeah, I suppose that's possible. I never thought of it." "Bill, if you took Adam's boat and you took your boat and you put one at one end of the island and the other at the other end of the island and hooked them to a jetty, you can talk to each other, can't you?" asked Willem. "Yes, that's right," agreed Bill. "Well, it's the same thing with the telephone, only they're not mounted on a boat. They are kept in a house," said Willem. "Where are the batteries?" asked Bill. "We have a building for the batteries, and we run wires to it. So that's how it all works." "I'll show you sometime, Bill," said Henry. "Oh, fine. I sort of know what you're talking about now. I know what a radio is, but I've never heard of a telephone before," said Bill. Willem thought for a while. He hadn't realized that his conversation and teachings in the country area had been limited to exactly what was available, and because nobody had ever bothered about telephones, he had never spoken about them. Bill always used radio, and most of the islanders had grown up with radio, but they've never ever had a telephone. Many of the big fishermen had base radios in their homes, so it was pretty easy to transfer Bill's thoughts from radio to telephone, but Willem hadn't realized how limited education becomes if you're not exposed to everything that is available. At the same time, Willem considered the ease with which things drift out of your reality if they're not needed. It was an interesting concept that Willem had never really considered before, and in that fraction of a second, his thoughts covered many possibilities that enhanced the wisdom that he was well known for. Chapter 25. On the way out of the house, Henry decided that he should take Bill in the car to Mary's house, as he was sure Bill would have never seen a car before. Henry stopped suddenly and said, "Let's go through this door here, and I'll show you how to get around the island." He then locked and closed the door to his main entrance before leading Bill and Willem through another door and into his massive garage. The huge garage was no surprise to either Bill or Willem. "Very modern cars. Which one are we taking?" asked Bill. Henry almost fell over, but Willem just smiled. Willem had not forgotten to teach Bill about cars, and he had remembered to show him how his old car worked. He had also taught Bill how the new ones worked, and he had shown him many photos. Well, we'll take the BMW," said Henry as he slouched a little. Bill walked straight over to the BMW and asked, "Which seat will I sit in?" Henry showed Bill to the passenger seat and allowed Willem to climb in behind. Then off they went on a tour of the island. In fact, it was only a tour of Norwich because people from Norwich considered that was the island. The tour took about 15 minutes because the roads that led all around the island, as they called it, but it was actually all around Norwich, were quite limited because of the width of the roads. Henry was one of the few with a fast car, and the roads that could handle those types of cars were rather limited. Many of the other roads were paved and only designed for bicycles and for walking. In fact, they missed a lot of the views and a lot of the unique areas around Norwich, but they saw the general way out and they got to experience the beaches and the beautiful buildings and the motels. Bill still could not understand how so many buildings could be placed on such a small area and how there were so many people. There seemed to be 100 times more people in Norwich than there were on the rest of the island. When they arrived at Mary's house, Bill was quite lost in trying to work out all of the questions about how people lived. When Henry slammed on the brakes and blew the horn, Bill almost jumped out of his skin. Willem laughed and tapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, Bill, you'll be all right. It will only take a couple of minutes and you'll be used to it all. And besides, Mary's a great character. Let's go and say hello." Henry looked around at Willem straight away as if to say, "How do you know so much about Mary?" But once again, Willem did not let on the extent of his contact with Mary. Mary soon appeared at the front door with a big smile and a happy face. Henry's heart jumped as he rushed around and gave her a big hug. "Come and meet my friends, Bill and Willem," he said excitedly. Mary's face was aglow. "I'm pleased to meet you, Bill. I've heard a lot about you already. Even though Henry's only known you a short while, he always talks about you," she said as she greeted her visitors. Bill felt so proud that somebody knew him and actually spoke about him when he was not there. Henry then turned to Willem and said, "Mary, I'd like you to meet Willem." Mary's heart felt such joy when she looked at Willem, and she hesitated for a moment. "It's time," said Willem as he looked to Mary. Henry and Bill did not understand what he meant, but Mary obviously did as she rushed straight up to Willem, wrapped her arms around him, and with joy in her heart said, "Oh, Dad, I've been waiting for you, waiting for so long to hear that." Henry could not believe his ears, but somehow Bill felt that was right. Mary and Willem were alike, and it was okay, and he felt good about father and daughter getting together. Mary and Willem stood there with their arms interlocked as they turned to Henry and Bill and announced, "Well, we suppose it's time we told you." Mary looked so lovingly at Willem as Willem took up the conversation and said, "Yes, it's about time. In fact, my name in Norwich is actually Heinrich Smithers." The whole picture came together in that moment for Henry, and then he understood why the picture became clear. It was because Mary did not want Henry to know who she was. Willem was Heinrich's original name, and he had taken that name on and went back to where he came from, back to the outer part of the island, so that Mary could still be who she was in the eyes of Henry. Then, without hesitation, Willem stood directly in front of Henry and said, "Henry, it's time you came clean." Henry did not know what Willem was talking about. Willem pressed further and said, "Henry, remember what you said to Bill and me earlier." Henry started to blush, and Willem said, "I'll say it to you again, Henry. It's time." Henry knew immediately what Willem was talking about and walked straight over to Mary and asked, "Mary, will you marry me?" Bill's heart jumped, and he thought to himself, "This is amazing. What a beautiful thing to happen." Mary started to cry as she wrapped her arms around Henry. "Oh, most certainly, Henry," she answered. I've waited for so long, but what has changed you? There are a lot of things that have changed me, and I think Bill started it all. Bill introduced me once again to the joys of life. Bill also introduced me to a great friend who has always looked after me, and he allowed me to feel the presence of the island again, replied Henry. Bill did not know what Henry was talking about, as he thought that he had never done anything for Henry. Henry turned to Bill and explained, Bill, it's just your innocence. It's your total belief, your stories, and your connection with Simeon, the same connection that I've always had. Everybody looked at one another when they heard the name Simeon, as it was familiar to them all. Their joy and great feelings transposed into an unbelievable companionship that took over the moment and made Henry's proposal to Mary something that Mary would never ever forget. Not that she would have forgotten anyway, but that special feeling had been planted in her heart. It was something that she knew would stay there forever. It was not long before the excitement turned to conversation, and the four of them spoke very quickly to one another about all sorts of things. They talked about all sorts of plans and about the possibilities for the future. Mary was very interested in Bill and how this was his first visit to Norwich. They spoke about Suzanne and the children and what was happening in Bill and Suzanne's life. And then the focus suddenly swept around to Suzanne and the children, and Bill wondered what Suzanne was up to at that time. It almost placed his excitement on hold as he focused in his normal manner back to Suzanne and the children. He could feel that they were having a wonderful time, and he knew that Suzanne and all of her friends were excited about the prospects of maybe one day meeting with Simeon in the flesh. Bill knew that this day was coming to an end, but he knew that he would have to visit Norwich again. He turned to everybody and said, "It is time for me to start heading back. I feel that it won't be long before Suzanne actually heads for home, and I'd like to be there to meet her when she gets there." Willem nodded his head, and Henry said, "That's fine, Bill." "Dad, are you staying?" asked Mary. "Yes, Bill can find his way back," answered Willem. "I'll talk to you tomorrow, Bill." "Fine," said Bill. "Thank you so much for a wonderful day." Bill shook everybody's hand and gave Mary a big hug before heading off along the track that he could see would lead back to the park where he could enter back into his own world. Chapter 26. Suzanne's day had gone much as she planned, but it also had so much more to it than what she could have ever imagined. The first friend that she had met with lived only a matter of 10 minutes away from her home, but the 2 hours that it took for her to get from there to the next place filled her life with joy and excitement. Her friend Julie had decided to walk along with her. Julie could not stand to miss the discussions of the day after she had heard Suzanne's story. She was so captured that she packed all of her work away and decided to walk with Suzanne to the next house. Before they reached the next house down the road, they met 3 or 4 other locals, and Julie, being quite a chatterbox, started to tell Suzanne's story there on the side of the road. She did this on 3 separate occasions, and as she did, Julie and Suzanne, along with Jamie, Samuel, and Martha, skipped along with joy and excitement. Helen somehow knew that Julie was about to arrive. The grapevine seemed to work so quickly in such a small place, and as Suzanne walked up the road with Julie and the children, Helen rushed out to say hello. She gave each of them a big hug in the flamboyant way she always did. Helen somehow knew there was another big story brewing. It was not often that she got visitors, particularly Suzanne. When all of the formalities and the greetings were over, Helen could not help herself. She just shook her arms and said impatiently, tell me, what's happening? What is it? You all look so happy. Tell me the story." Helen rushed them all inside the house to sit down to a pot of tea that she had already prepared. She was still asking about the details of the story, even while Suzanne had started to tell her about Simeon. Suzanne told of how Simeon had appeared to her and about how the greatest catch of fish she had ever seen just lifted up by itself and disappeared into the cloud that followed Simeon. She then told of how they were all fed and how the kids thrived. She spoke of how Bill had arrived and how close they had become, and then went on to describe what had happened to Bill at sea. She told how Joe had appeared in voice only. She told of how Joe had saved Bill from the same catastrophe that he had experienced and how Joe had explained what happened. Suzanne spoke of how Joe had died and how he warned Bill never to fish there again. Everyone sat quietly, taking in every detail of Suzanne's amazing story. Suzanne continued sharing her story. She shared with her friends how connected Bill and herself had become and explained how she knew where he was and what he was doing, and if she did not know, Simeon would tell her. She spoke of how Bill had known that there was something wrong when Jamie hurt herself. She told how Simeon had made Bill almost fly to get there, and how Simeon had told Suzanne about the hidden powers that Bill had in his hands. Then finally she spoke about how she had to convince Bill to put his hands on Jamie and how Jamie had healed immediately. The story was so emotional by this time, so well spoken and prepared that Helen gasped and had no voice to reply. They all sat there quietly, even the children did not move. When Suzanne reached the end of the story, Julie was so amazed. Well, how's that, Helen? Does that top all stories? Does that top all the stories that we've ever heard on the island? Asked Julie. Helen started to laugh and answered, Julie, I must say, you really brighten up everyone's life. Yes, it's a wonderful story, and I want to be there when everyone finds out. We can walk into town together. It's only another 10 minutes from here. We'll see everybody. Then we can come back and have something to eat before we go home. Is that all right with you, Suzanne? Suzanne was overwhelmed by the feelings of her two dearest friends. I'd love to do that. I'd also really love to find someone who I've heard about that I really should have seen years ago. Her name's Carmel Roberts, and she's a psychic, said Suzanne. Oh, yes, replied Julie. She'll be in town today, and we can call in and see her. She does readings in town. Well, if that's the case, then let's get going, said Suzanne as her eyes lit up with excitement. They each gathered up their things and gathered the children together before heading off into town. The weather was beautiful and the sun was shining its rays through the mild cloud, and it made a beautiful picture, a picture that could never be painted. Suzanne found herself almost disappearing into the picture as she walked along, not even hearing the words of Julie and Helen as they chatted away. Then, as she almost disappeared, she could see Bill in her mind's eye. She could see Bill standing and looking aghast at something, and she almost laughed. He looked so much like a little child who had just seen something for the first time ever. Her connection with Bill was amazing. It was such a marvelous feeling to maintain that connection with him and to actually feel his presence as she walked along, and to be able to see him so clearly in her mind's eye was so amazing and so comforting. When Helen tapped Suzanne on the shoulder, she was quite shocked at how quickly she had actually drifted off as she walked along. Oh, excuse me, Suzanne. You were somewhere else, apologized Helen. Yes, I was off with Bill, actually. He's in Norwich at the moment, said Suzanne. Julie and Helen looked at Suzanne as if to say, how could you let him go there? Suzanne quickly reassured them, it's all right. He was directed to go there, and he is with Willem, the teacher, so he'll be fine. It's something that Simeon said he'd have to do. It's just that it was arranged for him, she explained. Bill met a man who comes from Norwich. He met him at Joseph Hill, actually, and he's a very special person. Bill has a lot of faith in him, and the three of them went back to Norwich today just to have a look around. I can see Bill is so surprised at what he's seeing. I expect to have a good story from Bill when he gets home as well. The women started to chatter again with excitement, and their look of horror disappeared with the excitement of another story. It seemed like this new combination of Suzanne and Bill was producing a mass of stories that would excite the town for a long, long time. Martha, and Samuel were neatly stashed in what looked like an ancient stroller that had been modified slightly to fit the two of them, and they actually sat up as if they had been fitted for the purpose. They looked quite strange as they bounced along the track, with Jamie walking us alongside, happily skipping and laughing as she played with her brother and sister. Suddenly Martha screamed, which was a most unusual thing for Martha, as she was usually very quiet. Suzanne stopped immediately and crouched down to see what was wrong with her, only to discover a large ant had crawled high up on her leg. It seemed quite harmless, but it was very large and quite frightening to the little girl. Suzanne flicked the ant off and picked Martha up out of the stroller. She caressed and hugged her and spoke a special language to her that only Suzanne and Martha knew. Suzanne patted her until she finally calmed down. She asked Martha, "Did it frighten you?" "Yes," said Martha quietly. She did not say any more than that. She just answered yes and sobbed a little. She soon jumped with excitement as Jamie ran around in front of her and pulled a funny face. Jamie could do that to Martha, but nobody else could. Her mood changed immediately, and she wanted to chase Jamie. Suzanne put her down and lifted Samuel out as well, and they started to chase one another around right there on the track. It seemed like the whole world had stopped and focused on these three lively little children running around enjoying themselves. Helen looked at Suzanne and the three children and marveled at how far they had come in the last couple of weeks. The last time she had seen Suzanne, Helen thought she had looked sick. Her clothes were terrible and she was cold, and the children were sniffy and miserable, and they were frightened. And now here they were, and it was like the sun was shining from all of them. She could never have believed such a change to be possible, and so she made a mental note to sit down and talk in detail to Suzanne about how it felt and how it had all happened so quickly. Suzanne and her children, along with her friends, arrived in town just before lunch and decided to head directly to where Suzanne could talk to Carmel. They had figured it all out, that Suzanne could talk to Carmel and receive a reading while her two friends looked after the children. But by the time they had found Carmel, half of the town had gathered around and were listening to the stories that Julie was quite willing to pass on. Before long, the small numbers grew to 15 and then to 20, and almost everything stopped in the small town. The excitement became such that you would think there was a fair on. The whole town was focused on this beautiful story, and the visitors to the town had left everything, even their shopping, and were all listening and talking to their friends. The reading that Suzanne had thought she might receive was actually given to her by Carmel once again in the middle of the crowd at the top of her voice so that Suzanne could actually hear. Carmel told Susan, "You will leave the island within 2 months and you will return within 1 month. You will make such a difference to everybody here and such a difference to your family that at this stage it is beyond comprehension." Suzanne shook her head and really wanted to talk more to Carmel, as this was the same sort of statement that Carmel had made about losing Joe. The message was so certain and so clear. Suzanne could not speak and immediately wrapped her arms around Carmel and gave her a big hug. Carmel knew then that all was forgiven and that their lives together would be much better from here on in. Suzanne and the children had had such an exciting day that when Bill's signal came to Suzanne, she had trouble focusing. Although her heart went out to Bill straight away, the noise of the children and the noise of the people around her pulled her back and made it difficult to stay in contact with Bill. She knew that Bill had picked up her signal that she was ready to leave, and she knew that he expected nothing other than to feel her excitement, which she was sure he could feel. So, in the midst of flicking backwards and forwards between Bill and the children and the excitement of just having been told her future, Suzanne allowed herself to melt a little and go to each place. Her eyes glazed for a second, and she knew that everything was perfect. Suzanne made her apologies and told everyone there that it was time for her to leave. It was difficult to walk away from everyone, but they all knew that Jamie was getting tired and Samuel and Martha were both asleep by now, so it was time for them to go. Suzanne gathered the children, slipped Jamie up onto her back, and headed off home amongst many exciting waves and Cheerios. The instant she stepped onto the path, she started to feel the calm and beauty of the land around her. She had not realized until that point that she had been away from people for so long, and that even though at times she had been totally devastated by the loneliness, at this point she really appreciated the loneliness and no longer classed it as that. It was peace, the type of peace that she had not experienced for a very long time, not since she was a child. Instead of getting tired as she bounced along, she seemed to gain more and more energy. Her surroundings and the beauty stood out to such an extent that it almost took her breath away. The birds and animals came around and watched her as she cheerfully headed on her way back home to rendezvous with Bill. So I'll stop there at the end of chapter 26. Look forward to continuing with chapter 27 the next time I see you. So until then, I wish you a perfect life, perfect health, and a magic future. Thank you.